The chopping sound of the helicopter's propellers tore through the quiet of the morning in Cedar Grove, Montana, as Joseph Martin watched with clenched fists as yet another aircraft landed illegally on his property. The wheat field he had farmed for 3 generations now bore a circular concrete scar, an unauthorized helipad that his neighbor, Charles Davis, had sneakily built during Joseph's trip to visit his sick daughter in Seattle. "Another flight from your executives, Charles?" Joseph shouted over the noise of the propellers slowing down, as a group of men in expensive suits hurriedly disembarked. Charles Davis, a former Wall Street broker who had moved to Montana only 2 years ago, flashed his characteristic smug smile as he greeted his clients. "Just providing an essential service to the community, Joe," Charles replied with false cordiality, adjusting his silk tie. "You know how hard it is to get to Billings from medical emergencies." Joseph felt his blood boil in his veins. In his 65 years of life, he had never met anyone as blatantly dishonest as Charles Davis. The heliport, built under the pretext of serving as a medical evacuation point for the small community of Cedar Grove, had not transported a single patient in its 6 months of operation. Instead, it had become a lucrative air cab business for executives who preferred to avoid the 2-hour drive to Billings Airport. Margaret, Joseph's wife of 40 years, approached her husband and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "The lawyers called this morning," she whispered. "They say we have a solid case." The Martin couple had built their life on that land. The wheat field was not only their livelihood, but also their legacy. The farm had passed from father to son since his grandfather had emigrated from Ireland in 1910. Now, a considerable part of its best arable land had been usurped by an ambitious outsider who manipulated local laws in his favor. At Cedar Grove Town Hall, the town clerk, Rebecca Wheeler, a middle-aged woman with a strong sense of justice, rummaged through old archives looking for documents that might help the Martins. "Something's wrong here," she muttered, examining the building permit submitted by Charles. "These signatures don't look right." The situation began to attract the attention of the small community of 3,000 inhabitants. Some residents, seduced by Charles's promise of modernization, supported the heliport. Others, mainly traditional farming families, were concerned about the precedent that was being set. "It's destroying our way of life," commented Frank Henderson, owner of the neighboring farm, during an impromptu meeting at Mary's Cafe. "First it's a helipad, then what will it be? A luxury resort?" The tension reached its peak when Joseph's cattle, frightened by the constant noise of the helicopters, broke through a fence and invaded the adjacent property, causing considerable damage. Charles wasted no time in filing a lawsuit, demanding compensation for the damage and accusing Joseph of obstruction of essential services when he tried to stop the landings by using his tractor to block access to the helipad. "You can't do that, Joseph," warned Sandra Lloyd, the local lawyer who had taken on the Martins' case. "He's waiting for you to make a mistake like that. We need to win this legally." In the evening, sitting on their century-old balcony, Joseph and Margaret gazed at the lights of the heliport that now marred their familiar horizon. The distant sound of another helicopter approaching made Margaret squeeze her husband's hand. "Remember when we got married, Joe?" she asked softly. "You promised me that we would build something that would last for generations. Let's not let him destroy." Joseph nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It wasn't just his land that was at stake, but the future of his family and the values of his community. The upcoming court case represented more than a dispute over property. It was a battle for the preservation of a way of life. Rebecca Wheeler continued her quiet investigation at City Hall, discovering increasingly serious inconsistencies in the documents presented by Charles. The permits had apparently been approved in record time, skipping crucial steps in the process. "There's something very wrong here," she said to herself, discreetly making copies of the suspicious documents. Meanwhile, Charles Davis was expanding his operations, now scheduling night flights that further disturbed the local peace. His growing empire was attracting businessmen from all over the region, turning the quiet countryside of Cedar Grove into a bustling hub of unauthorized business. The community was beginning to divide. At the local market, Sunday church services and farmers' association meetings, conversations revolved around the conflict. Some saw Charles as a progressive bringing economic development. Others considered him an invader destroying the social fabric of the town. Joseph knew that the coming battle would define not only his future, but the character of Cedar Grove. As he watched another helicopter depart, taking with it the peace of his land, he made a silent promise to fight to the end, not just for his property, but for everything it represented. Rebecca Wheeler couldn't sleep. The document she had discovered at the town hall occupied her mind as she reread the notes for the third time in her small living room. The signatures on the building permits for the heliport didn't just look forged. They were forged. After comparing them with previous records, she was absolutely certain that the signature of the former director of works, who died 6 months ago, had been forged. "We need to proceed with caution," warned Sandra Lloyd, the Martins' lawyer, examining the evidence Rebecca had brought during a secret meeting in the back office of the local church. "Charles Davis has powerful connections in Helena. We can't just accuse him of forgery without being prepared for the storm that will follow." Joseph Martin joined the meeting, accompanied by his wife Margaret and Frank Henderson. The group formed an unlikely alliance against what was becoming a threat not only to the Martin farm, but to the very integrity of Cedar Grove. "I found out something else," Frank Henderson said, lowering his voice. "My cousin works for the Civil Aviation Department in Billings. Charles doesn't have all the necessary licenses to operate a commercial air cab service. He's using loopholes in the private flight regulations." The revelation provoked a murmur of outrage among those present. Charles Davis wasn't just operating illegally on stolen land. He was potentially putting lives at risk with unregulated air operations. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Charles Davis was conducting his own meeting at the newly opened Cedar Grove Country Club. Between glasses of expensive wine and imported cigars, he liaised with local businessmen and regional politicians. "Imagine Cedar Grove as the new business center of Montana," Charles gesticulated enthusiastically. "We don't have to rely on agriculture alone anymore. We can turn this town into something bigger." Among his guests was Michael Preston, a Billings real estate developer known for his controversial ventures. "The heliport is just the beginning," Preston commented, studying a map of the region. "With the right infrastructure, we can turn this whole area into a high-end commercial and residential complex." News of the expansion plan quickly reached Sandra Lloyd's ears through a waiter at the club who owed her family favors. The lawyer realized that they were dealing with something much bigger than just an illegal heliport. "They want to turn Cedar Grove into a playground for the rich," Sandra explained during an emergency meeting with the Martins. "The heliport is just the first piece of the puzzle. If we don't stop it now, other families will lose their land." Joseph felt the weight of responsibility increase. His personal struggle had turned into a battle for the soul of Cedar Grove. Margaret, always his safe haven, held his hand tightly. "We're not alone in this, Joe." Rebecca continued her investigation, now focusing on the connections between Charles Davis and certain members of the city council. She discovered a series of suspicious deposits in the campaign accounts of 2 councilors who had strongly supported the construction of the heliport. Tension in the city increased day by day. The flights, now more frequent, disturbed not only the Martins' cattle, but also began to affect other farmers in the area. The constant noise of the helicopters was causing stress in the animals and damaging milk production on neighboring farms. Mary, the owner of the local cafe, turned her establishment into an informal center of resistance. Between cups of coffee and homemade pies, residents exchanged information and planned strategies. "My father built this cafe 50 years ago," she declared during a particularly heated meeting. "I'm not going to let them turn our town into an open-air shopping mall." Sandra Lloyd worked tirelessly, preparing the lawsuit that could expose the whole scheme. With the evidence provided by Rebecca and the testimonies of other aggrieved residents, she began to build a solid case, not only against the illegal heliport, but against the entire network of corruption that supported it. "We need to act soon," Sandra warned, showing Joseph recent photos of the site. Charles had started expanding the heliport area, destroying even more farmland. He's trying to set a precedent. The more time passes, the harder it will be to reverse the situation. The community began to mobilize in unexpected ways. Reverend Davidson offered the church basement for strategy meetings. The local newspaper, the Cedar Grove Gazette began publishing a series of investigative articles about the impact of the heliport on the region's agricultural economy. A group of high school students, led by Frank Henderson's daughter, started a social media campaign exposing the environmental damage caused by the illegal development. Their posts attracted the attention of state environmental groups. Charles Davis, sensing the growing opposition, stepped up his intimidation tactics. Defamation lawsuits began to arrive at the homes of those who publicly spoke out against the heliport. Surveillance cameras mysteriously appeared pointed at the properties of key opponents. "He's trying to scare us," Joseph said during a family gathering. "But I won't back down. This land means more to me than any threat he can make." The battle for Cedar Grove was just beginning, and each side was readying its weapons for what promised to be a decisive confrontation. As helicopter blades continued to slice through the mountain sky, an entire community was mobilizing to defend their way of life. Rebecca Wheeler's discovery of the forged permits triggered a series of events that no one in Cedar Grove could have predicted. During one particularly tense evening, she received an unexpected visit from Marcus Bennett, a former city official who had mysteriously resigned 3 months before the heliport was approved. "I can't carry this secret any longer," Marcus confessed, his hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee in Rebecca's kitchen. Charles Davis is not alone in this operation. There are powerful people in Helena behind him, including State Senator Warren Phillips. Rebecca felt her heart race. Senator Phillips was known for his rural development projects that often resulted in the eviction of farming families from their land in favor of commercial enterprises. The next day, Sandra Lloyd called an urgent meeting at the Martin home. Joseph, Margaret, Frank Henderson, and Rebecca listened attentively as Marcus revealed the details of the scheme. The heliport was just the first phase of a larger plan to turn Cedar Grove into a luxury resort, complete with golf course and high-end condominiums. "They offer me money to speed up the approvals," Marcus explained, avoiding looking directly at those present. "When I refused, the threat started. I had to think about my family." Meanwhile, Charles Davis was stepping up its operations. The number of daily flights had doubled, and construction equipment began arriving overnight. Joseph watched helplessly as more of his land was gradually taken over. Mary, from the local cafe, became an unexpected source of valuable information. Her strategic location allowed her to overhear important conversations between Charles's associates. "They're planning a big meeting for next weekend," she informed Sandra. "Investors from all over the state will be coming to see the project." The lawyer saw this as an opportunity. With the help of Rebecca and Marcus, she began to put together a detailed dossier of irregularities. Frank Henderson's tech-savvy teenage son managed to hack into the heliport security system and obtain recordings from the cameras showing secret meetings between Charles and public officials. Tension in the city reached its peak when Margaret Martin suffered an anxiety attack after finding strange men photographing her house. Joseph, normally calm and restrained, confronted Charles Davis in the local market. "This has to stop, Charles," he declared loudly, attracting the attention of the other customers. "You may have money and connections, but you can't destroy our lives like this." Charles just smiled, his characteristic air of superiority intact. "It's the price of progress, Joe. Some have to be sacrificed for the greater good. But don't worry. I'll make sure you get fair compensation when you lose the case." What Charles didn't know was that Sandra Lloyd had managed to schedule a hearing with federal judge Richard Armstrong, known for his firm stance against municipal corruption. The evidence collected by Rebecca and Marcus, along with testimony from other aggrieved residents, formed a solid case. The Cedar Grove community began to come together in surprising ways. Reverend Davidson organized a prayer vigil in front of the heliport, attracting hundreds of residents. The Cedar Grove Gazette published a special series on the history of the region's farming families, highlighting their cultural and economic importance. Frank Henderson discovered that other farmers in neighboring counties had faced similar situations with companies linked to Senator Phillips. A pattern of manipulation and corruption was beginning to emerge. "It's not just about our land now," Joseph said during a community meeting at the Martin Barn. "It's about stopping them from doing this to other families, other communities." Rebecca continued her meticulous investigation. now focusing on the financial connections between Charles Davis and shell companies registered in tax havens. Each document revealed a new layer of corruption and manipulation. The situation took an even more serious turn when Marcus Bennett was involved in a suspicious car accident just 2 days before he was due to give formal evidence. Although he survived, the message was clear. Powerful forces wanted to silence the truth. Sandra Lloyd went on to work in police protection, storing copies of the evidence in various safe places. "They're desperate," she explained to the Martins. "That means we're close to something big." The Cedar Grove community was preparing for a decisive battle. The future of their land, their way of life, and their values was at stake. While the sound of helicopters continued to disturb the peace of the valley, a quiet determination grew among the residents. "My grandfather always said that good land must be defended," Joseph commented to Margaret as they watched the sunset from their balcony. "I guess I never fully understood what he meant until now." The battle for Cedar Grove was about to enter its most crucial phase, and no one could predict who would emerge victorious. But one thing was certain: the small community would not give up without a fight. The news of Marcus Bennett's accident raced through Cedar Grove like fire through dry straw. While he recovered in the Billings Hospital, Sandra Lloyd and Rebecca Wheeler worked tirelessly to organize the evidence before the hearing with Judge Armstrong. Time was running out, and the threats were becoming more and more explicit. "They found a listening device in my office this morning," Sandra reported during a secret meeting at the Martin home. "They're getting desperate." Joseph observed the group gathered in his living room. Rebecca with her folders of documents, Frank Henderson holding a laptop with compromising recordings, and Mary from the local cafe, who had become a valuable informant. Each of them was risking everything to expose the truth. A new element emerged when Lisa Chun, an investigative reporter for the Billings Gazette, arrived in Cedar Grove after receiving an anonymous tip about the case. Her presence added a new layer of pressure on Charles Davis and his associates. "I discovered connections between Senator Phillips and 3 other similar projects in Montana," Lisa revealed during an interview with Sandra. "It's a systematic pattern of appropriating rural land for commercial development." Charles Davis, sensing the siege closing in, stepped up his tactics. One morning, Joseph woke up to find tractors positioned around the helipad, ready to start an even bigger expansion. Margaret, with tears in her eyes, watched through the kitchen window as more of her land was about to be destroyed. "He can't do this," she whispered. "We haven't even had the hearing yet." Sandra Lloyd immediately applied for an emergency injunction, but the local judge, known for his connections to Senator Phillips, was conveniently on vacation. The replacement, a newly appointed young man, was hesitant to make a decision that could go against powerful interests. The community, however, did not stand idly by. Dozens of local farmers formed a human barrier around the Martin property, preventing the tractors from advancing. Reverend Davidson led prayers at the site, while high school students live-streamed the peaceful protest on social media. "This isn't just about a farm," Frank Henderson declared for Lisa Chen's cameras. "It's about stopping powerful people from destroying entire communities for their own profit." Rebecca Wheeler, working late at City Hall, made a crucial discovery. Old documents revealed that the land where the heliport was built was part of a historic reserve protected by state law. Charles Davis and his associates had deliberately concealed this information during the approval process. "That changes everything," Sandra explained to the Martins. "It's not just a private property issue now. It's a violation of historic preservation laws." The tension reached its peak when armed men, claiming to be private security guards hired by Charles, began patrolling the perimeter of the heliport. Their intimidating presence caused concern among residents, especially after an incident in which they threatened a group of teenagers photographing the site. The local sheriff, Robert Martinez, initially hesitant to get involved, was forced to act when the security guards overstepped their legal boundaries. "You don't have the authority to restrict access to public roads," he warned, finally taking a clear stance in the conflict. Lisa Chun continued her investigation, discovering that Charles Davis and Senator Phillips' scheme extended far beyond Cedar Grove. Leaked documents revealed plans for similar projects in several rural Montana communities, all following the same pattern of manipulation and intimidation. "They choose small, tight-knit communities," she explained during a meeting with Sandra and the Martins. They rely on fear and intimidation. They rely on fear and isolation to silence opposition. The date of the hearing with Judge Armstrong was approaching, and the tension in Cedar Grove was palpable. Charles Davis was seen in frequent meetings with his lawyers at the country club, while caravans of cars with Helena license plates arrived and departed regularly. Margaret Martin, finding strength she didn't even know she possessed, organized a support group for families affected by similar projects in other cities. "We are not alone in this struggle," she said during a meeting in the church basement, "and we will not be silenced." Joseph, watching his community united in defense not only of their land, but of a way of life, felt a mixture of pride and determination. The sound of the helicopters continued to disturb the peace of Cedar Grove, but now it carried a new meaning, a reminder of a battle that needed to be won not just by them, but by all small communities threatened by greed disguised as progress. The federal courtroom in Billings was packed on the morning of the hearing. Joseph Martin sat next to Sandra Lloyd, watching Charles Davis and his team of expensive lawyers occupy the opposite table. Judge Armstrong, known for his uncompromising impartiality, was studying the preliminary documents with meticulous attention. Lisa Chun of the Billings Gazette took a seat in the front row, her laptop ready to document every moment. Behind her, virtually all of Cedar Grove seemed to have mobilized to watch the decisive showdown. Margaret Martin was shaking Rebecca Wheeler's hand, both exchanging nervous glances. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Armstrong," announced the bailiff. The first blow came when Sandra Lloyd presented her evidence about the historic reserve. The judge removed his glasses, his expression visibly hardening as he examined the ancient documents discovered by Rebecca. "Mr. Davis," Judge Armstrong interrupted the defense presentation, "were you aware that this land was part of a protected historic reserve when you began construction?" Charles Davis hesitated for the first time since the conflict began. His lead lawyer quickly intervened, but the damage was done. The judge ordered a 15-minute recess. During the break, a commotion erupted in the court corridor. Marcus Bennett had arrived, still using crutches after his accident. At his side was a man few recognized, Gerald Phillips, nephew of Senator Warren Phillips. "I want to testify," Gerald announced to Sandra Lloyd. "I have proof that my uncle and Charles Davis planned all this over a year ago, including," he hesitated, looking at Marcus, "including the accident." Gerald Phillips' revelation caused a political earthquake in Montana. Internal documents showed an elaborate scheme to acquire rural land through questionable tactics, turning farming communities into lucrative business ventures. "I can't be a part of this anymore," Gerald explained to the court. "I saw what they did to Marcus and how many other families were harmed. Some things are more important than money." Gerald's testimony was devastating for the defense. Charles Davis watched his facade of confidence finally crumbling as his empire of lies collapsed. The lawyers whispered frantically, papers being passed around in desperation. Lisa Chun typed furiously, her headlines already taking shape. "Land grab scheme exposed in federal court. State senator implicated." Judge Armstrong, after hearing all the testimony, didn't need long for his decision. In addition to declaring the construction of the heliport illegal, he ordered a full federal investigation into the activities of Senator Phillips and his associates. "The law exists to protect all citizens, not just the powerful," declared the judge in his final pronouncement. "What we saw here today was a coordinated attempt to subvert not only property rights, but the very fabric of our rural communities." For the Martins and all of Cedar Grove, the victory was bittersweet. While they celebrated the court's decision, they knew that the work of rebuilding was just beginning. The field damaged by the heliport would need years to fully recover. "We're going to help," Frank Henderson declared during the community meeting after the trial. "All of us. This isn't just Martin land, it's part of our shared history." In the weeks that followed, Cedar Grove demonstrated the true meaning of community. Farmers came together to restore the damaged land. Reverend Davidson organized a fund to help other communities affected by similar schemes. Mary turned her cafe into an information center for landowners facing similar threats. Rebecca Wheeler, whose painstaking work had been instrumental in exposing the truth, was appointed to a position on the state's new Rural Land Protection Committee. Never again, she vowed, will we allow greed and corruption to destroy our communities. Joseph and Margaret Martin, sitting on their porch on a quiet fall afternoon, watched the countryside regain its natural serenity. The silence, once interrupted by the constant noise of helicopters, was now broken only by the soft rustle of wheat in the wind. Your grandfather would be proud, Margaret commented softly, holding her husband's hand, not just for defending the land, but for showing that there are still things money can't buy. Joseph nodded, thinking of future generations who would inherit not only the land, but also the story of how a small community faced and overcame seemingly invincible forces. Lisa Chun published a series of award-winning reports on the case, exposing similar schemes across the country. Her work inspired changes in state legislation, strengthening the protection of rural lands from predatory development. Charles Davis left Cedar Grove quietly one night, his dream of a rural empire in ruins. Senator Phillips resigned amid growing scandal, and federal investigations began to unravel a web of corruption that stretched across several states. The battle for Cedar Grove was over, but its impact would continue to reverberate. The small community proved that, when united for a just cause, ordinary people can stand up to and defeat even the most powerful adversaries. Do you know what I'm most proud of? Joseph commented to Margaret as they watched the sunset. It wasn't just winning. It was seeing how everyone pulled together, how we defended not just our land, but our values. The legacy of the battle for Cedar Grove would live on, a reminder that some things, land, community, justice, are worth every sacrifice to preserve.